In the story you are about to hear, all names have been changed to protect the identities of those involved. Let's call our protagonist Emily, though that is not her real name. In a world where truth is overshadowed by skepticism and fear, it's better this way. The deserted road felt like a dark abyss, swallowed by the shadows of the mountains surrounding Claremont, California. In the sky, stars flickered like silent sentinels, oblivious to what was about to unfold. The night seemed ordinary, quiet, cold, harmless. But the small details told a different story. A faint static on the radio of a lone driver. A coyote howling, not at the moon, but at something no one could see. It was here, in this forgotten corner of the map, that Emily Cartwright captured the impossible. The frequency felt alive, pulsing like a heart beating outside a body. First, a subtle hum, then a metallic crackle, and finally, words. Words in a language that sounded more like a buried memory than an actual transmission. But who, or what, could have sent it? Hours later, Emily was found in a field, barefoot, with marks etched into her skin like burned runes. The watch on her wrist had stopped at 3:15 a.m. Her eyes, once bright and curious, now carried a shadow no one could explain. When she finally gathered the strength to speak, the words slipped out like a frozen whisper. They are here, but they want more. The town murmured. The government stayed silent, and the sky, always the sky, seemed to hide something that watched, waiting patiently. Emily knew something inside her had changed, something she didn't want, but couldn't ignore. Because in Claremont, the nights were never the same again, and the lights on the horizon seemed to ask, who will be next? It all started with the radio. Not the kind that plays pop music or the local news nobody listens to. It was an old transceiver, a Kenwood TS-820 model my grandfather used to chat with truckers and other enthusiasts. I had spent months restoring that machine, fine-tuning circuits, cleaning every rusty knob, until I finally brought it back to life. It was my sanctuary. At night, while Claremont slept, I would sit in the small room I called my studio, a space filled with wires, blinking lights, and the comforting hum of static. That night, I was randomly tuning frequencies, as I often did, picking up stray conversations and distant sounds. A trucker from Texas complaining about the road. 2 young men playing with Morse code. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until it appeared. The sound pierced the silence like a needle. First, a deep hum, almost subsonic, that I felt more in my chest than heard. Then, a metallic crackle, like someone scratching the surface of an old microphone. And then, the words. I remember holding my breath. Not because they were scary, but because they weren't human. They had an odd rhythm, a musicality that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't English or Spanish or any language I had ever heard before. And yet, there was something familiar, like a memory just out of reach. Alcana, Tresfa, Ulte. Disconnected, hypnotic sounds. I leaned closer to the transceiver, as if I could decipher them just by listening harder. And then came the final phrase. I'm not sure if it was real, or if my mind filled in the gaps, but it sounded exactly like this. Emily, come. My heart stopped. I remember looking around, as if someone might be behind me, whispering those words. It was impossible. No one knew I was there. But in that moment, the impossible seemed like the least of my worries. I stood up, breathing heavily, and opened the window. The night outside was cold but calm. Nothing but crickets and the wind over the wheat fields. But something felt wrong. The moon, which had been shining high in the sky, seemed paler, almost distant. My gaze was drawn to the horizon, where the mountains cut jagged silhouettes against the starry sky. That's when I saw the light. A bright blue flash, almost blinding, that lasted only an instant, but was enough to burn its image into my retina. I should have stopped there. I should have turned off the radio, locked the door, and hid under the covers, like a frightened child. But I didn't. Instead, I grabbed my coat, my hiking boots, and stepped out the door. The road felt endless, winding between empty fields and the absolute silence of the mountains. The dim headlights of my old Jeep barely illuminated enough to keep me on the road, but they couldn't push back the oppressive darkness surrounding me. It was as if the night itself was watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. The radio remained on, its static filling the silence. Every so often, the deep hum returned, like the signature of the mysterious frequency. The strange thing was that, as I drove further, the intensity of the sound seemed to grow. I knew I shouldn't keep going, but something inside me, a primal curiosity, almost like an instinct, wouldn't let me stop. And then I saw the light again. A blue beam, this time stronger, coming from somewhere beyond the hills. It was so bright that the world around it seemed to vanish, swallowed by a surreal void. I parked the Jeep at the side of the road and stepped out, my heart pounding like a drum. The biting cold of the night wrapped around me, but I barely noticed. All that mattered was that light, pulsing on the horizon like a beacon. It seemed to call to me, and I couldn't resist. My steps carried me through a small field, where the tall wheat swayed gently in the wind. As I moved forward, the sound on the radio began to shift. It was as if the metallic noises and incomprehensible words had evolved, transforming into something almost musical, an ethereal melody not meant for human ears, yet it drew me in like a moth to a flame. And then it happened. The light intensified, flooding the field around me with an impossible clarity. I could see every stalk of wheat, every pebble on the ground, as if it were daylight. And then it appeared, a shadow silhouetted against the light, tall and slender, but with indistinct contours. It wasn't human, that much was clear. Its movements were fluid, almost liquid, as if it glided through space rather than walked. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt heavy, as if rooted to the ground. And then I felt it, an invisible pressure surrounding me, like giant hands holding both my body and mind at the same time. It was as if I was being examined, every thought and memory laid bare under a microscope. Flashes began to flood my mind, images that made no sense, stars spiraling in impossible patterns, perfect geometric shapes glowing with golden light, and those eyes, black eyes, deep and endless, staring at me with an intensity that seemed to pierce my soul. I remember falling to my knees, my body trembling as if I were being electrocuted. The light around me began to spin, forming a vortex that seemed to consume everything. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was the creature's silhouette, now so close that I could feel its warmth. Or maybe it was cold. It was impossible to tell. And then, everything went black. I woke up with my face pressed against the damp ground of the field. The sky above me was clear again, speckled with stars. There was no sign of the light, the shadow, or anything that could explain what had just happened. My head throbbed, and my body felt strange, as if it wasn't entirely mine. That's when I noticed the marks. My hands were covered with symbols, precise lines and circles that glowed faintly in the dark, as if they were made of light. I rubbed my skin frantically, but the symbols wouldn't come off. They were etched into me, like scars. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't respond. The world spun, and everything seemed out of focus. Eventually, I heard a distant sound, the engine of a car. Using what little strength I had left, I screamed, and then the headlights found me. It was the local sheriff, who, as I was told later, had been patrolling the area after reports of strange lights in the sky. I was taken to the hospital, but no one could explain what had happened. My clothes were burned in places, my boots were missing, and the doctors looked at me as if I were some kind of walking enigma. The marks on my hands were photographed and analyzed, but no one could decipher them. And then, when I finally returned home, the nightmares began. The nights following my return to Claremont weren't nights of rest. These weren't ordinary nightmares. They were visions, intense dreams that felt real, as if I were living another life in a place where the laws of physics didn't apply. Nights where I woke up drenched in sweat, my hands trembling, with the eerie sensation that I wasn't alone in the room. At first, they were just flashes, quick images of places I had never seen before, a sky with 2 moons shining over a desert landscape, a white chamber without doors or windows, where I felt the weight of dozens of invisible eyes studying me. But as days passed, these visions began to take shape and purpose. I saw faces, not human ones, but so clear that their presence was undeniable. Their black eyes, deep and endless, seemed to transmit thoughts directly into my mind. You called us, Emily. Now, we are connected. The marks on my hands were another mystery. They didn't fade, and in sunlight, they seemed to pulse gently, as if they had a life of their own. I hid them from everyone, wearing gloves even in the stifling heat. Some nights, I felt them burning, as if something was trying to emerge from within me. That's when I noticed the changes. Small things at first. I felt more alert, as if my body required less sleep. My hearing became sharper, picking up sounds no one else around me seemed to notice. Even my perception of time felt different, as though seconds stretched or contracted, depending on the moment. But then, the changes became more apparent. That afternoon, while walking to the local market, a crow landed on a nearby branch. It stared at me, tilting its head to one side, as if it were trying to understand me. I stood still, watching it, and that's when I heard it. Not with my ears, but inside my head. You are different. They marked you. The shock was so great that I stumbled and fell to my knees on the sidewalk. When I looked up again, the crow was gone, but the sensation remained. I was changing. Something inside me had been activated. People in Claremont began to talk, small whispers that spread like wildfire. Emily saw something. They say it was aliens. The marks. Have you seen the photos? My phone rang constantly with messages from acquaintances and strangers. Some claimed they wanted to help. Others just wanted to know the most sordid details. I ignored them. How could I explain the unexplainable? It was then that I reached out to an online UFO group. After days of frantic research, I found a forum called Skywatchers Anonymous. They were a small group, but its members seemed to take these phenomena seriously. I posted an anonymous message describing part of what had happened to me, omitting details for my own safety. Within hours, I received dozens of responses, and one, in particular, caught my attention. The pattern of symbols you described isn't new. We've seen it before in similar cases. Get in touch. The user who sent the message went by the name Starlight 1976. He seemed to know more than he should, and something about the way he wrote made me feel he understood what I was going through. After exchanging a few private messages, we arranged a video call. When Starlight's face appeared on the screen, I was surprised. He wasn't a middle-aged fanatic as I had expected, but a man in his 30s, with short hair and a serious expression. His name was Daniel, and he looked exhausted, like someone carrying a secret for too long. "Emily," he began, wasting no time on formalities. "What you saw and what happened to you. It's not an isolated event. There are patterns." He started showing me images, photographs of other individuals with marks similar to mine, some recent, others dating back decades. There were maps with marked points in remote locations, all near areas where mysterious lights had been sighted. "This isn't random," Daniel continued. "They choose people, and these people, well, they're never the same again." "But why?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why me?" He hesitated, as if carefully considering his words. "Because you responded to the call, and because they are preparing for something bigger." Daniel's words echoed in my mind all night. He was right about one thing. I would never be the same. As I sat on my bed, staring at the marks on my hands that glowed faintly in the dim light, I felt something I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, as if a door had been opened inside me, and something unknown was waiting on the other side. Outside, the lights in the sky began to flicker again. The lights in the sky became more frequent. At first, they were just bright points that blinked and disappeared, something easily dismissed as stars or airplanes. But I knew better. They moved too quickly, in patterns that defied any logical explanation. And every time they appeared, I felt something. A pressure in my chest, like a call I couldn't ignore. It was Daniel who suggested we meet in person. "There are things I can't tell you online," he wrote in his last message. "There's something you need to see for yourself." I hesitated at first, but the truth was, after everything I had experienced, staying in Claremont was as terrifying as leaving. So, I agreed. I drove for hours, crossing deserted roads and forgotten small towns, until I reached the agreed location, a secluded clearing in the mountains. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, standing next to a sturdy telescope and a van, equipped with instruments I couldn't identify. He greeted me with a quick nod, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You came," he said, almost relieved. "Like I had a choice," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my nervousness was evident. Daniel didn't waste time on introductions. He guided me to the telescope and adjusted the focus, pointing toward a constellation I barely recognized. "Look," he said. At first, all I saw was the glow of the stars, but then I noticed it. Amid the darkness, something moved. It wasn't a star or a satellite. It was a ship. Small, almost imperceptible, but clearly artificial. It floated with a grace that seemed impossible, as if it defied the very laws of the universe. "Do you see it?" Daniel asked, and all I could do was nod. He then showed me maps, diagrams, and even radio recordings. "These signals," he explained, pointing to a chart displaying regular pulses, "are the same ones you intercepted. They're coming from there, from that ship." My mind reeled. It wasn't just real. It was organized, calculated. "And the marks?" I asked, raising my hands, still covered with the glowing symbols. "What do they mean?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. That's what I'm not sure about. But I know the people who receive them. They're like antennas." "Antennas?" I repeated, incredulous. "Yes," he said. "You pick up things the rest of us, ordinary humans, can't. That's why they choose you. You're not just an experiment. You're part of something bigger." Before I could process what he had said, something happened. The air around us grew heavy, charged with electricity. The lights in the sky, which had been small and distant, began to grow, descending like giant orbs. Daniel grabbed my arm, guiding me behind the van. "It's starting," he whispered. The light engulfed us, a blue so intense it seemed to melt reality around us. My body began to tingle, as if it were being disassembled and reassembled at the same time. I looked at Daniel, but he seemed frozen, his eyes locked on the light. That's when I felt the presence again, that invisible pressure, as if something were touching my mind. But this time, it wasn't just flashes. I saw everything. Stars being born and dying, entire worlds orbiting in harmony, and a voice. Not a voice like Daniel's, but something soundless, speaking directly to my consciousness. "You are the bridge." The words echoed inside me, resonating in every fiber of my being. Before I could respond, I was swallowed by darkness. When I woke up, I was alone. The clearing was silent, as if nothing had happened. Daniel's van was still there, but he wasn't. His equipment was destroyed, scattered across the ground, as if ripped apart by an invisible force. My hands trembled as I realized the marks had changed. The symbols, once geometric, now formed a more complex pattern, almost like a map. My heart raced. It was as if they had left something behind, something inside me. And then I heard the sound, a distant hum that seemed to come from the sky. I looked up and saw the ship, now closer, hovering above the trees. It was so immense it seemed to cover the entire horizon. Its contours pulsed with a light that felt alive. For the first time, I felt I understood. They weren't just here to study. They were waiting for something I couldn't fully comprehend, but knew was inevitable. I returned to Claremont that night, but I knew I couldn't stay for long. People stared at me more than ever, as if they sensed I carried something different. Even without saying a word, I knew everyone was waiting for the lights in the sky to return. And so was I, because somehow I knew this was only the beginning. The days following my return to Claremont passed like a dense, oppressive fog. People seemed more restless, their whispers now turning into outright rumors. "The lights are coming back," they said. "Something big is about to happen." And I knew they were right. The weight of the marks on my hands was a constant reminder, an anchor binding me to a mystery I couldn't escape. I still had more questions than answers. Where was Daniel? Why had the lights chosen me? And above all, what did that phrase mean? "You are the bridge." My nights were filled with increasingly vivid dreams, where the slender figures and their black eyes stared at me with a mix of curiosity and expectation. They weren't just observers. They were waiting for something from me. That night, the call came in a different way. I was in my studio, surrounded by the wires and monitors of the old transceiver. Since returning from the clearing, I had avoided turning it on. But something about that night made me change my mind. When I turned the tuning dial, the sound that emerged was almost deafening, a rising hum, interspersed with pulses that resonated like heartbeats. And within the frequency, a single word emerged, clear and unmistakable. "Now." My body froze, but instinct pushed me into action. I grabbed my coat, the keys to the Jeep, and headed out, guided more by impulse than logic. The road felt darker than ever, as if the night itself had closed in around me. But something on the horizon drew me in, a pulsating light, shining with the intensity of a beacon. It seemed alive, almost breathing. When I reached the location, I immediately knew I wasn't alone. Other cars were parked along the field, their headlights off, as if their owners knew any interference could disrupt what was about to happen. In the distance, I saw figures moving in the darkness, some alone, others in small groups. They were looking at the sky, waiting, just like me. And then, the lights appeared. Not just one or two, but dozens. They descended slowly, forming a pattern in the sky that looked like a code, something undecipherable to human eyes. My heart raced as I felt the familiar pressure in my mind, as if I were being pulled by an invisible force. Suddenly, an intense light engulfed me, and everything around me disappeared. There were no more cars, no people, no field. I was in a white, infinite space, surrounded by a silence so absolute it was deafening. In front of me, the figures emerged, tall, slender, with black eyes that seemed to absorb all light. They didn't speak with words, but with images and sensations that flooded my mind. They showed me worlds beyond imagination, ancient civilizations that had perished, and a future that felt terrifyingly close. A future where humanity stood on the brink of something irreversible. "You are the bridge," they said again. But this time I understood. I was a link, a connection between them and us. They weren't here to destroy, but to warn. Something was coming, something so vast and incomprehensible that even they couldn't stop it. When the light faded, I was back in the field. The people around me were motionless, as if trapped in the same trance I had just experienced. Some were staring at the sky, others at their hands, where marks similar to mine had begun to appear. They too had been chosen. That's when I realized my mission wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. I needed to share what I had seen, what I had felt. But how do you explain the unexplainable? How do you make someone believe in something that defies all laws of logic and reason? The only thing I knew for sure was that the lights would return. And when they did, I had to be ready. That night, as I drove back home, I looked at the sky one last time. The stars were there, shining bright and indifferent as always. But now I knew they hid something much greater, something that watched, waiting. Because after all, we were never alone, and so the stars continued to twinkle as they always had. But who could ignore the whispers they carried? Emily knew her story didn't end there. And us? Well, perhaps we are the next pieces of this cosmic puzzle. The lights in the sky still flicker, and Claremont continues to guard secrets that don't belong to us. Or do they? If you, like Emily, feel that there is more between the heavens and earth than we can comprehend, don't forget to like, share your theories in the comments, and subscribe to The Traveler, Alien Abductions and Encounters. The next transmission is already being picked up. Will you be there to hear it?